Welcome to the Immigration Therapist Podcast, a podcast for immigration attorneys that want to learn more about the psychological and emotional aspects of these cases, and for therapists that want to learn more about these kinds of evaluations. So, on today's episode, we are going to talk about trauma evaluations versus non-trauma evaluations. So, the purpose of immigration evaluations is for the attorney to learn more about the client's case and for immigration to understand what happened, how the emotional, psychological symptoms derived by what happened are affecting the client, right? So either, again, we've talked about that your client may be the immigrant, meaning the applicant who's applying with immigration, or the citizen who is sponsoring their immigrant spouse, for example. So again, the purpose is for immigration, for this client to be, the light to be shed into this person's life. So some evaluations the focus is to talk about the trauma. Trauma happened, and it's the main focus of the evaluation. So some examples are VAWA, domestic violence. Another example is asylum, who most of the time, most likely, I want to say VAWA for sure 100%. Asylum, there's only maybe one or two that maybe the person wasn't really traumatized, but there's still room for trauma. Then again, they're fleeing to this country. There's obviously UNT visas, who obviously, what happened, the reason why they're applying is because trauma happened. Again, U visas when the client was a victim of crime, and then T visas when there's human trafficking involved. Now, there's non-trauma evaluations, like, for example, hardship cases. Maybe there's no trauma because, again, the focus is just talking about how the citizen, the resident, is going to be affected if their spouse, if their son is deported. There's also the fiance visa. That's, the primary goal there is not to talk about trauma. It's to talk about the distance that the citizen is living as a result of their fiance being in another country. N648, for example, that's about how, the focus is the disability that the immigrant has that prevents them from passing the civics part of their citizenship process. So the reason why I wanted to talk about the difference between these trauma versus non-trauma evaluations is because there's pros and cons. Well, I want to reframe that. Not that there's pros and cons, but there's an easy and difficult level to all of these. With the non-trauma evaluations, it's easier in a sense that you're not dealing so much with trauma. So the client's pretty functional, pretty cognitively, emotionally functional, present. The sessions run smoother because they're there, present. There's no triggers, flashbacks going on. They're talking about a difficult situation, but they can be verbal and intentional about the information they gave you. Now, there's the trauma evaluations. So these, it takes a higher level of clinical skills, because not only are you writing the report and collecting information to conduct the analysis, you're also having to do with the crisis. You're basically having to, unfortunately, and to be honest with you, this is the part that I don't like as a therapist, because as therapists, our default intention is to treat the client. So this is why this is one thing that I really, don't love about writing immigration evaluations, is dealing with trauma survivors and having them become re-exposed to the trauma in order to write a good evaluation. So again, going back to the pros and cons, in my opinion. So the pros of going back to the non-trauma, the pros of writing non-trauma evaluations is that maybe the client is more functional. You don't have many acute symptoms going on that would really prevent the client from speaking. There's no need for crisis de-escalation. Now, the con is that sometimes the client can't really connect to the feeling. For example, in hardship evaluations, as I've mentioned on a different episode, you might be doing a hardship evaluation and the citizen lives with their spouse and they wake up every day and they're together every day, and the citizen doesn't really feel in their skin what would it be like if their spouse wasn't here. So if they were deported. So those clients might have a difficulty connecting with the feeling, their symptoms, the emotional, the psychological impact that they would experience. So in my opinion, that would be the con of working with non-trauma evaluations. Now, going back to the trauma evaluations, the pro of working with these types of evals is that you are able to, clinically speaking, you're able to collect a lot of information there. You'll have chief complaint, you'll have presenting symptoms, you'll have plenty to observe and report on the immigration evaluation. There's a lot of content for you to talk about. You'll talk about the trauma, the flashbacks, your impression, their presenting symptoms during session, how their affect, meaning how they looked during the assessment sessions. You'll have a lot to talk about, clinically speaking. The con of doing trauma evaluations is that, and again, let's keep in mind that we're doing immigration evaluations, meaning the purpose is to complete a document, not to provide therapy. As much as I hate saying that, because these are the clients that need it the most. So the con of working with these very trauma triggered clients is that, like I mentioned before, you'll need to write the report while also dealing with crisis de-escalation. I've had clients go into full-blown panic attacks during sessions, and it was just honestly heartbreaking to watch someone have to talk about something that they really, exerted so much energy into trying to forget or trying to block out of their mind. As therapists, we know that there's no such thing, but it just feels insensitive to have clients just re-expose them to the trauma and have them talk about it in detail and narrate what happened in order for you to collect the information. So that can be very challenging. Not to mention that, you're stuck between, two impossible situations, because while you need to do an immigration evaluation and complete the executive part of why you're meeting, you can't really do it because they're in they might get full blown into a crisis state. But also there's the other aspect that if you go into crisis de-escalation and you help them process and you help them regulate themselves, you might be cutting into precious writing time. And sessions are limited. Sessions are 50 minutes. For the most part, they range between 45 to 60 minutes. And you might be cutting into precious time. So what I recommend is, when dealing with trauma immigration cases, what I recommend is preparing the client. Again, preparation is key. As trauma-focused and trauma-informed therapists, we know that abuse survivors, they lose their empowerment, their sense of self, their sense of control. So, in regular therapy, that's what we would work on. Their sense of control, empowerment, their sense of feeling in charge of their space. So that's what I touch on before I start my immigration evaluations with trauma cases. I always start the sessions, and that's what I recommend, that you always start the sessions by preparing the client, by explaining to them what will come. For example, I apologize in advance because I always tell them, look, unfortunately, sometimes I will need to redirect you. I will need to interrupt you because, again, the goal here is to do an immigration evaluation. But you try to be as humane as you can and and prepare them to the best of your abilities before you get started so that they know what to expect. You can come up with maybe a number system, a safe word, a kind of like a plan of action if they become too triggered. So there are all these things that you can do in order to be humane and keep the tone therapeutic, while again keeping in mind that the whole purpose of why you're meeting isn't to do therapy. It's to do an immigration evaluation. Because again, a lot of these clients, they're already hurting financially because they're paying for their immigration case. They set aside a specific amount of money to pay for your services. So they really can't afford to, go over. Let's say you told them you'd need 2 sessions. And now because you spent time doing crisis stabilization, you'll need, 2 more sessions or 1 more session. So at that point, you have a problem because do you have the time? Can you afford to see them pro bono? Sure, you might do that to that one client, but what about the next clients, the next few trauma evaluations that you're going to do? So for trauma evaluations, I definitely recommend that you walk a fine line between being humane and therapeutic while also redirecting and staying focused with the goal of writing an immigration evaluation. Now, when it comes to the non-trauma evaluations, I also recommend the same. We can prepare the clients in the beginning by explaining to them that, unfortunately, this is a process of their immigration case, and we need to connect to the emotional, psychological, the emotional and psychological symptoms that they might be experiencing that maybe they haven't thought about, and that's our job to help them connect to those. With non-trauma evaluations, I usually open that door, the emotional and psychological realm, by asking if the client's done therapy before, by explaining how therapy works and what's expected here. It's a safe space. So, again, to sum up today's episode, with non-trauma evaluations, your goal is to get them to open up and connect to their emotions. And then with trauma evaluations, the goal is to create a very safe, therapeutic environment while keeping in mind that you're doing an immigration evaluation and there's a deadline. So I hope this helps. And I hope that this, clears up a little bit the difference between trauma and non-trauma evaluations. So as usual, you can find us online on Instagram at the handle immigration _evaluations_center. Again, immigration_evaluations_center. I'll see you in the next one.